creative artist come forward to replace these barbaric aspects of existence by a less ignoble adventure. There is no natural life of man. He is, and has always been, a sheath of varied and even incompatible possibilities, a palimpsest of inherited dispositions. It was the habit of many writers in the early 20th century to speak of competition and the narrow, private life of trade and saving and suspicious isolation, as though such things were in some exceptional way proper to the human constitution, and as though openness of mind and a preference for achievement over possession were abnormal and rather unsubstantial qualities. How wrong that was the history of the decades immediately following the establishment of the World Republic witnesses. Once the world was released from the hardening insecurities of a needless struggle for life that was collectively planless and individually absorbing, it became apparent that there was in the vast mass of people a long smothered passion to make things. The world broke out into making, and at first mainly into aesthetic making. This phase of history, which has been not inaptly termed the efflorescence, is still, to a large extent, with us. The majority of our population consists of artists, and the bulk of activity in the world lies no longer with necessities, but with their elaboration, decoration, and refinement. There has been an evident change in the quality of this making during recent years. It becomes more purposeful than it was, losing something of its first elegance and prettiness, and gaining in intensity. But that is a change rather of hue than of nature. That comes with a deepening philosophy and a sounder education. For the first joyous exercises of fancy we perceive now the deliberation of a more constructive imagination. There is a natural order in these things, and art comes before science, as the satisfaction of more elemental needs come before art, and as play and pleasure come in a human life before the development of a settled purpose. For thousands of years this gathering impulse to creative work must have struggled in man against the limitations imposed upon him by his social ineptitude. It was a long smoldering fire that flamed out at last in all these things. The evidence of a pathetic, perpetually thwarted urgency to make something, is one of the most touching aspects of the relics and records of our immediate ancestors. There exists still in the death area about the London bombs, a region of deserted small homes, that furnish the most illuminating comment on the old state of affairs. These homes are entirely horrible, uniform, square, squat, hideously proportioned, uncomfortable, dingy, and in some respects quite filthy. Only people in complete disrepair of anything better could have lived in them. But to each is attracted a ridiculous little rectangle of land called the garden, containing usually a prop for drying clothes and a loathsome box of offal, the dustbin, full of eggshells, cinders, and such like refuse. Now that one may go about this region in comparative security, for the London radiations have dwindled to inconsiderable proportions, it is possible to trace in nearly every one of these gardens some effort to make. Here it is a poor little plank summer-house, here it is a fountain of bricks and oyster shells, here a rockery, here a workshop, and in the houses everywhere there are pitiful little decorations, clumsy models, feeble drawings. These efforts are almost incredibly inept, like the drawings of blindfolded men. They are only one shade less harrowing to a sympathetic observer than the scribblings one finds upon the walls of the old prisons, but there they are, witnessing to the poor buried instincts that struggled up towards the light. The God of joyous expression our poor fathers ignorantly sought, our freedom has declared to us. In the old days the common ambition of every simple soul was to possess a little property, a patch of land, a house uncontrolled by others, and independence, as the English used to put it. And what made this desire for freedom and prosperity so strong was very evidently the dream of self-expression, of doing something with it, of playing with it, of making a personal delightfulness, a distinctiveness. Property was never more than a means to an end, nor avarice more than a perversion. Men owned in order to do freely. Now that every one of us has his own apartments and his own privacy secure, this disposition to own has found its release in a new direction. Men study and save and strive that they may leave behind them a series of panels in some public arcade, a row of carven figures along a terrace, a grove, a pavilion. Or they give themselves to the penetration of some still opaque riddle in phenomena, as once men gave themselves to the accumulation of riches. The work that was once the whole substance of social existence, for most men spent all their lives in earning a living, is now no more than was the burden upon one of those old climbers who carried knapsacks of provisions on their backs, in order that they might ascend mountains. It matters little to the easy charities of our emancipated time that most people who have made their labor contribution produce neither new beauty nor new wisdom, but are simply about those pleasant activities and enjoyments that reassure them that they are alive. They help, it may be, by reception and reverberation, and they hinder nothing. Section 11. Now, all this phase of gigantic change in the contours and appearances of human life which is going on all about us, a change as rapid and as wonderful as the swift ripening of adolescence to manhood after the barbaric boyish years, is correlated with moral and mental changes at least as unprecedented. It is not as if old things were going out of life and new things coming in. It is rather that the altered circumstances of men are making an appeal to elements in his nature that have hitherto been suppressed, and checking tendencies that have hitherto been overstimulated and overdeveloped. He has not so much grown and altered his essential being, as turned new aspects to the light. Such turnings round into a new attitude the world has seen on a less extensive scale before. The Highlanders of the 17th century, for example, were cruel and bloodthirsty robbers. In the 19th, their descendants were conspicuously trusty and honorable men. There was not a people in Western Europe in the early 20th century that seemed capable of hideous massacres, and none that had not been guilty of them within the previous 2 centuries. The free, frank, kindly, gentle life of the prosperous classes in any European country before the years of the last wars was in a different world of thought and feeling from that of the dingy, suspicious, secretive, and uncharitable existence of the respectable poor, or of the constant personal violence, the squalor and naive passions of the lowest stratum. Yet there were no differences of blood and inherent quality between these worlds. Their differences were all in circumstances, suggestion, and habits of mind. And turning to more individual instances, the constantly observed difference between one portion of a life and another consequent upon a religious conversion were a standing example of the versatile possibilities of human nature. The catastrophe of the atomic bombs, which shook men out of cities and businesses and economic relations, shook them also out of their old established habits of thought, and out of the lightly held beliefs and prejudices that came down to them from the past. To borrow a word from the old-fashioned chemists, men were made nascent, they were released from old ties. For good or evil, they were ready for new associations. The council carried them forward for good. Perhaps if his bombs had reached